Have you ever wondered what would happen if the person you treated like dirt turned out to be someone you couldn't afford to lose? The traffic on Victoria Island was suffocating. 3 lanes of gleaming SUVs crawled forward in the afternoon heat, drivers honking uselessly at the gridlock ahead. In the back seat of a pearl-white Range Rover, Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi scrolled through her phone, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen. Beside her, her friends Ronke and Aisha were dissecting someone's Instagram post with surgical precision. "Did you see what she wore to the gala?" Ronke was saying. "Aso Ebi from last season. I almost died of second-hand embarrassment." In the driver's seat, Yusuf Danjuma sat perfectly still, his eyes on the road, his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His uniform was spotless as always, pressed so sharp you could cut paper on the creases. He'd been driving for Mrs. Ibironke for 18 months, and in that time, he'd learned that silence was survival. "Yusuf," Ibironke's voice cut through the car like glass. "Did you wash this car this morning?" "Yes, Ma." "Then why is there dust on the dashboard?" Yusuf glanced at the dashboard. It was spotless. "I'm sorry, Ma. I'll clean it again when we arrive." "You'll clean it now. Pull over." "Ma, we're in the middle of traffic." "Are you talking back to me?" Ibironke's voice rose sharp enough to make Ronke and Aisha look up from their phones. "Pull over. Now." Before we continue, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and join Tales of Us. Because what you're about to witness is a story about dignity, humiliation, and a transformation that nobody saw coming. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Yusuf pulled the Range Rover to the side of the road as horns blared around them. He stepped out, opened the back door, retrieved a cloth from the trunk, and began wiping down a dashboard that didn't need wiping. Cars streamed past, people stared, and Ibironke sat in the back seat with her friends, laughing. "He's so obedient," Aisha observed, her tone making it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. "Like a well-trained dog." "That's why I hired him," Ibironke said. "Some people are born to serve. They don't have the intelligence or ambition for anything else. You can see it in how they carry themselves. Always looking down. Always quiet." Yusuf heard every word through the open door. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his hands continued their steady work. When he finished, he closed the door without a word, returned to the driver's seat, and merged back into traffic. "Much better," Ibironke said, though she hadn't even looked at the dashboard. This was Yusuf's life. This had been his life for 18 months. Wake at 5. Exercise in the cramped staff quarters behind Eco Crest residence. Shower in the communal bathroom. Press his uniform until it looked military grade. Polish the car until it gleamed. Drive Mrs. Ibironke wherever she demanded, whenever she demanded, while she dissected his existence with her friends as if he couldn't hear. Return at night. Sleep. Repeat. The other staff at Echo Crest treated him like furniture. The cook never learned his name, just called him Driver. The housekeepers gossiped around him as if he were invisible. Even the security guards, who should have been his equals, looked through him rather than at him. But here's what none of them knew. Here's what Mrs. Ibironke and her designer-dressed friends didn't see. Every night, after Yusuf returned to his small room in the staff quarters, after he'd removed his uniform and showered away the day's humiliations, he opened a locked suitcase under his bed. Inside were photographs from another life. Magazine covers, Fashion Week programs, contracts with agency logos, and a single garment bag containing a suit that cost more than he now earned in 6 months. He would look at these remnants for exactly 5 minutes, not longer. Then he would close the suitcase, lock it, slide it back under the bed, and lie down staring at the ceiling until sleep came, because Yusuf Danjuma had a past he'd buried so deeply that sometimes even he forgot it existed. A past where people knew his name, his face, his presence, a past that had ended so abruptly and painfully that he'd chosen invisibility over ever risking that kind of exposure again. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what happened next. Because Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi was about to make a decision that would unravel everything she thought she knew about power. 3 days later, Yusuf was polishing the Range Rover in the circular driveway of Echo Crest when he heard voices approaching. Mrs. Ibironke and her friends were returning from their morning tennis game, still in their designer athletic wear, laughing about something. "My birthday party is going to be legendary this year," Ibironke was saying. "Azure Loft Lounge, full catering, only the most influential people in Lagos." "Who's on the guest list?" Ronke asked. Ibironke began rattling off names. Business people, socialites, minor celebrities, people whose Instagram followers numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Then she paused, and her smile turned cruel. "And Yusuf, of course." The conversation stopped. Even Aisha looked confused. "Your driver?" she said. "Why would you invite your driver?" "Not as staff," Ibironke clarified. "As a guest. A real guest. I'm going to send him a formal invitation and everything." Ronke started laughing first. Then Aisha joined in. "You're terrible," Ronke said, but she was smiling. "He'll look so out of place." "Exactly." Ibironke's eyes glittered with malice. "Can you imagine? Him in his cheap clothes, trying to make conversation with actual successful people. It'll be the entertainment of the evening." Yusuf continued polishing the car, his face expressionless. But his hands had stopped moving. "What if he doesn't come?" Aisha asked. "He will," Ibironke said confidently. "People like him are so desperate for validation that they'll walk straight into humiliation if you frame it as inclusion." "Watch." She approached the car. Yusuf straightened, waiting. "Yusuf, I'm having my birthday party in 2 weeks at Azure Loft Lounge. I'd like you to attend. As my guest, not as staff. I'll send you a proper invitation." Yusuf looked at her for a long moment. His face revealed nothing. "Thank you, Ma," he finally said. "You'll come?" "Yes, Ma." Ibironke smiled like a cat with a mouse. "Wonderful. It's formal attire, by the way. I'm sure you'll figure something out." She walked into the house, her friends trailing behind her, their laughter echoing across the driveway. Yusuf stood there alone, cloth in hand, staring at nothing. Then he finished polishing the car, put away his supplies, and returned to his quarters. That night, he opened the suitcase again. This time, he looked at the contents for more than 5 minutes. Much more. Over the next 2 weeks, Ibironke reminded Yusuf about the party constantly. In the car, she'd mention it casually. "Only 12 days until my party. You haven't forgotten, have you?" At the house, she'd comment on his uniform. "I hope you're planning something better than that for the party." Her friends joined in whenever they were around. "Are you excited for Saturday?" they'd ask with poisonous sweetness. Yusuf responded to everything with the same 2 words. "Yes, Ma." His composure drove Ibironke crazy. She wanted to see him squirm, wanted to watch him realize he was walking into a trap. But Yusuf never gave her that satisfaction. He just nodded, drove, cleaned, and remained perfectly, maddeningly calm. What Ibironke didn't see were the nights in Yusuf's room. The suitcase stayed open now. He'd sit on his bed looking at photographs of a person he used to be, wrestling with a decision he'd thought he'd never have to make again. The person in those photographs was confident, poised, comfortable being seen. That person had walked runways in Milan and Paris, had modelled for campaigns that appeared on billboards across 3 continents, had been called the next great African face by fashion magazines that mattered. That person had also been destroyed by a single scandal, a misunderstanding that became gossip, that became fact in the social media echo chamber, false accusations from a jealous colleague, a cancelled contract. A reputation demolished overnight. Yusuf, who had never learned to defend himself publicly, had simply disappeared instead of fighting back. For 3 years he'd been invisible, working menial jobs, staying off social media, avoiding cameras, building a life where nobody looked at him closely enough to recognize who he used to be. And now Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi, who thought she was inviting her driver to humiliate him, was actually inviting him to step back into the light. The question was, would he? The morning of the party, Yusuf woke at 5 as always. But instead of his usual routine, he did something different. He called in sick. Sick? The estate manager sounded suspicious. You've never been sick. I'm sorry, sir. I'll return tomorrow. Mrs. Ibironke needs the car today for shopping. She can use the second driver. There was a long pause. Fine, but if this is some game, Yusuf... It's not a game, sir. He hung up and stood in his small room, looking at the suit laid out on his bed. Charcoal grey, perfectly tailored, with a subtle sheen that caught light without being flashy. He'd bought it 4 years ago for a Fashion Week after-party. It cost more than most people's monthly rent. And it still fit perfectly because Yusuf had never stopped taking care of himself, even when he was invisible. He showered, shaved carefully, and dressed slowly. Each button, each cufflink, the ritual of transformation. When he looked in the small mirror above his sink, he saw someone he'd almost forgotten. Not the quiet driver who looked down, but the model who knew how to command a room just by walking into it. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Azure Loft Lounge. 8 p.m. Formal attire. Looking forward to seeing you there. Mrs. Adeyemi Yusuf stared at the message. He could still back out. Could pretend to be too sick. Could maintain his invisibility and avoid the risk of being seen again. Being seen meant being vulnerable, being remembered, being exposed to the kind of judgment that had destroyed him once before. But something had shifted in him over the past 2 weeks. Maybe it was Ibironke's constant cruelty. Maybe it was seeing his own photos and remembering who he used to be. Maybe it was just exhaustion from being invisible for so long. He typed back, "I'll be there." Then he sat on his bed and waited for evening. Meanwhile, at Azure Loft Lounge, Ibironke was in her element. The venue was stunning, all floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Lagos Lagoon, elegant lighting, and decor that screamed expensive taste. Guests were arriving in designer outfits, air-kissing and networking with the precision of people whose friendships were really transactions. "This is perfect," Ronke said, admiring the setup. "You've outdone yourself." "Wait until Yusuf arrives," Ibironke said with a smile that would make a shark nervous. "That's when the real entertainment begins." Aisha frowned slightly. "Are you sure this is a good idea? What if he actually looks presentable?" Ibironke laughed. "Have you seen his clothes? He owns 3 shirts and they all have frayed collars. Trust me, this will be spectacular." The party filled up. Music played. Champagne flowed. People who hadn't spoken to Ibironke in months suddenly remembered how much they valued her friendship. She floated through the crowd, accepting birthday wishes like tributes, secure in her power and position. At 8:47 p.m., Yusuf Danjuma walked through the door of Azure Loft Lounge. The first person to notice was the hostess at the entrance, who looked up from her list and simply stared. Then a waiter passing with champagne flutes stopped mid-step. Then a woman near the door elbowed her husband and pointed. Yusuf moved through the entrance with the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself but can't be ignored. The charcoal suit fit him like it had been made for this exact moment. His posture was perfect without being stiff. His expression was calm without being cold. He looked like he belonged not just at this party, but at any party, anywhere in the world. The room didn't go silent dramatically. It was subtler than that. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, people tracked his movement without quite realizing they were doing it. Ibironke was mid-laugh at someone's joke when she saw him. The laugh died in her throat. "That's not possible," her mind insisted. "That's my driver. He can't look like that." But he did. And the worst part was that people were noticing. A woman Ibironke barely knew was already approaching Yusuf with an interested smile. A business mogul Ibironke had been trying to network with for months was studying him with open curiosity. Yusuf accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter with a nod of thanks. He didn't scan the room nervously or try to find a corner to hide in. He just stood there completely comfortable, as if expensive parties in luxury lounges were the most natural thing in the world. Because once upon a time, they had been. "Who is that?" someone near Ibironke asked. He's... Ibironke struggled to form words. "He looks familiar," Aisha said slowly, squinting at Yusuf. "Like I've seen him somewhere before." Before Ibironke could respond, Malik Stone appeared at her elbow. Malik was a fashion creative director and talent scout, someone Ibironke had invited to boost her social credibility. He was staring at Yusuf like he'd seen a ghost. "Is that who I think it is?" Malik breathed. "Who do you think it is?" Ibironke managed. "Yusuf Danjuma. Oh my God. I thought he'd vanished completely. What is he doing here?" Ibironke's brain short-circuited. "You know him?" "Know him?" He was one of the most promising models in African fashion 3 years ago. Campaigns for major brands, editorial spreads. He was going to be huge, and then he just disappeared. There were rumors about some scandal, but nobody really knew what happened. Comment below right now and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is about to escalate in ways that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about judgment and dignity. Across the room, Yusuf was being approached by multiple people now. They introduced themselves, asked what he did, where he'd been. He answered with the kind of gracious politeness that made people lean in, wanting more of his attention. "I work in private service," he said when someone asked about his career. Which was technically true. He just didn't specify what kind of service. "You should be modelling," a woman said bluntly. "You have an incredible presence." Yusuf smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he knew something the rest of the room didn't. "I used to, actually." "Really? For whom?" "Various houses in Europe. It was another lifetime." People were taking photos. Not obviously, but Ibironke saw phones angling in Yusuf's direction. Saw the subtle taps and swipes that meant those photos were being uploaded, shared. Spreading through social media like wildfire, she felt control slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to look pathetic, out of place, desperate. He was supposed to confirm every cruel thing she'd thought about people like him, people who served, people who didn't matter. Instead, he looked like he mattered more than anyone in the room. Malik was already moving toward Yusuf, and Ibironke watched in horror as they began talking. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Malik's animated expressions, saw him pulling out his phone, and saw Yusuf's careful nods. "I need air," Ibironke announced to no one in particular and fled to the balcony. Ronke followed her. "What's happening? Why is everyone treating your driver like a celebrity?" "Because apparently he is one," Ibironke said, her voice tight with rage and something else, fear. Or was. Or I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Maybe you should talk to him?" "And say what?" "Sorry for treating you like garbage for 18 months while you were secretly someone important." "He's not that important," Ronke said, but she didn't sound convinced. "He's just a guy in a nice suit." But they both knew that wasn't true. They could see it through the glass doors. Yusuf wasn't just wearing a nice suit, he was inhabiting it, embodying it. And everyone at that party could feel the difference between someone wearing expensive clothes and someone who belonged in them. Inside, Malik was handing Yusuf a business card. "Listen, I know you left the industry, but fashion has changed. There's more protection now, more awareness about false narratives. And honestly, there's no one who looks like you working right now. You could walk into any agency tomorrow and be signed by sunset." Yusuf turned the card over in his fingers. Nova Line Agency, one of the most respected firms in African fashion. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't think too long. Malik said. Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever. Someone's going to discover you again. Might as well be on your terms. Yusuf stayed at the party for exactly 90 minutes. He made polite conversation, exchanged contact information with people who mattered in industries he'd once walked away from, accepted compliments with gracious humility. And then, while Ibironke was trapped in a conversation she couldn't escape, he left as quietly as he'd arrived. He didn't say goodbye to the birthday woman, didn't acknowledge the trap she'd tried to set. Just walked out into the Lagos night, got into a taxi, and returned to Echo Crest residence through the staff entrance as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. And by the time Yusuf woke the next morning, the internet had made sure everyone knew it. Mystery Man steals show at elite birthday party, read one blog headline. Who is the gorgeous stranger who crashed Lagos society? Asked another. Photos from the party had spread across Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Yusuf in his charcoal suit, champagne in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a fashion editorial. Comments poured in from people trying to identify him. Some remembered his modelling work from years before. Others just wanted to know how to find him. And in the middle of it all, there was Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi, visible in several photos, her face tight with what people were politely calling surprise but looked a lot more like rage. Her phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Friends, acquaintances, people who'd been at the party, all asking the same question. Who was that man? When she finally went downstairs at 9, she found Yusuf in the driveway, polishing the Range Rover as if it were any other Sunday morning. He wore his standard uniform. His expression was neutral. Everything about him screamed normalcy except for one small detail. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Yusuf. Ibironke's voice was sharp. Yes, Ma. He straightened, meeting her eyes for the first time in 18 months. We need to talk. In my office. Of course, Ma. They walked through the house to her home office, a space designed to intimidate with its stark minimalism and expensive art. Ibironke sat behind her desk. Yusuf stood in front of it, waiting. Why didn't you tell me? Ibironke finally said. Tell you what, Ma. Don't play stupid. You know exactly what I mean. That you were a model, that people know you. You never asked, Ma. The response was so simple it took her breath away. I never asked. So you just let me treat you like... You let everyone treat you like you were nothing. I am your driver, Ma. That's not nothing. You know what I mean. Her voice rose despite her intention to stay controlled. You humiliated me last night. Everyone's talking about it, about you, about how I didn't know who my own driver was. I didn't humiliate you, Ma. I accepted your invitation and attended your party, as you requested. In a suit worth more than a month's salary. You said formal attire, Ma. I wore formal attire. Ibironke stared at him, searching for mockery or smugness, or anything she could use to justify her rage, but Yusuf's face showed only polite attention. He was giving her nothing. People are asking questions, she said, about why someone like you is working as my driver. Someone like me? You know what I mean. No, Ma, I don't. She stood abruptly, pacing behind her desk. This is unacceptable. The whole situation. I can't have my staff becoming more famous than I am. It's inappropriate. Her phone buzzed. A text from Malik Stone. Can you give me Yusuf's contact info? We'd like to meet with him. Another buzz. An email from a fashion magazine requesting an interview about the mysterious guest at your birthday celebration. Another buzz. A message from Ronke. Girl, do you know how many people are asking about your driver? This is actually helping your visibility. Ibironke looked up at Yusuf, who stood perfectly still waiting for her to finish, and she realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that she'd lost something she couldn't name, not controlled exactly, but the certainty that she was the most important person in any room. The conviction that people like Yusuf existed to make people like her feel superior. You can go, she said quietly. Yes, Ma. He left, And Ibironke sat down slowly, staring at the closed door, trying to understand what had just happened. Over the next week, Yusuf's life began to shift in ways both subtle and seismic. Malik Stone reached out directly, having gotten his contact information from someone at the party. They met for coffee at a quiet cafe in Ikoyi, far from Echo Crest and prying eyes. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending I don't know what happened 3 years ago," Malik said after they'd ordered. "The accusations, the dropped contracts, the way you just vanished." Yusuf nodded, saying nothing. "For what it's worth, I never believed it. The industry is brutal, and jealousy makes people cruel. But that's all old news. What matters is now. And right now, you have something the industry desperately needs: authenticity, maturity, a story." "I'm not interested in being a story," Yusuf said quietly. "Too late. You already are." Those photos from Ibironke's party have been shared thousands of times. People are fascinated. And in fashion, fascination is currency. "I walked away from that currency once. Because you were pushed out. This time, you'd come back on your terms. We've worked with dozens of models who disappeared and returned. The industry loves a comeback narrative. And I'm offering you the chance to write yours." Yusuf looked into his coffee, seeing his reflection in the dark liquid. "I'm not the same person I was." "Good. That person was talented but naive. You've lived now. Survived. That shows in your presence. In the way you carry yourself. It's not arrogance, but it's not subservience either. It's dignity. And dignity is rare enough to be valuable." Malik slid a folder across the table. Inside were contracts, proposals, and potential campaigns. Major brands. Ethical companies. Projects with substance rather than just style. "Think about it," Malik said. "But don't think too long. Someone else will discover you eventually. Might as well be someone who actually gives a damn about protecting you this time." Yusuf took the folder home. That night, he opened the suitcase under his bed one more time. But instead of looking at the past, he looked at the future. At the possibility of reclaiming something he thought he'd lost forever: the right to be seen without being destroyed. He made his decision at 3 in the morning, sitting on his bed in the staff quarters of a house where the woman who paid his salary barely spoke to him anymore. He called Malik. "I'm in." "Smart man. Come to the agency tomorrow at 10. We'll start the audition process." "Audition?" "Formality. Trust me, you'll be fine." The audition was held at Nova Line Agency's headquarters in Lekki. Clean white walls, professional equipment, photographers and stylists who treated models like collaborators rather than clothes hangers. Yusuf walked into the space and felt muscle memory take over. He knew how to move, how to angle his body for light, how to project emotion without overacting, how to make stillness interesting. The casting director watched him for 15 minutes, then turned to Malik. "Why did we ever let him disappear?" "We didn't let him. We failed him." "Well, we're not failing him again. Sign him. Full representation. I want him for the Heritage Collection campaign." Just like that, Yusuf Danjuma was back. Not as the naive young model who'd been destroyed by rumours, but as something more durable, more valuable. Within 2 weeks, he had 3 major campaigns booked. Within a month, his face was on billboards across Lagos. The same face that Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi had seen every morning for 18 months and never really looked at was now 40 feet tall, selling luxury watches and architectural services and the kind of aspirational lifestyle that people paid good money to access. And Ibironke? Her world was contracting in inverse proportion to Yusuf's expansion. 1 year after the birthday party that changed everything, Yusuf Danjuma stood in the offices of Nova Line Agency, reviewing contracts for an international campaign. His phone buzzed constantly with opportunities, interview requests, collaboration pitches. His calendar was booked 3 months out. His bank account had numbers that would have seemed fictional 2 years ago. But the thing that mattered most to him wasn't the money or the fame. It was the young man sitting across from him in the agency's mentorship lounge, nervous hands gripping a portfolio that had seen better days. "I don't know if I'm good enough," the young man was saying. His name was Chidi, 19 years old, discovered by a scout at a Lagos market where he worked selling phone accessories. "Everyone here is so polished, so professional. I don't know how to act in these spaces." Yusuf smiled, remembering another version of himself years ago, feeling exactly the same way. "Can I tell you something?" Chidi nodded. 2 years ago, I was working as a driver. I lived in staff quarters. I ate meals people didn't think I deserved. And I'd convinced myself that was all I'd ever be, because letting myself want more hurt too much. Chidi's eyes widened. "But you're Yusuf Danjuma. You're on billboards." "Now I am. But the person on those billboards? He was always there. He was just hidden under fear and shame and the weight of other people's judgments. The work isn't becoming someone new. It's removing the layers that hide who you already are." "What if I remove the layers and there's nothing underneath?" "Then you were never nothing to begin with. You were just convinced you were by people who needed you to be small so they could feel big." Yusuf leaned forward. "Listen to me carefully. The industry will try to break you. People will try to use you. There will be moments when disappearing feels easier than fighting, but your dignity is yours. No one can take it unless you hand it to them, and you don't have to hand it to anyone." Chidi nodded slowly, and Yusuf saw something shift in his expression. That dangerous, precious spark of hope. This was why Yusuf had returned to the industry, not for the fame or the money, though both were welcome, but for this, for the chance to be the person he'd needed when he was drowning, to tell young talents that their worth wasn't determined by their worst moment or their lowest point. He'd formalized it 6 months ago, the Danjuma Initiative, a mentorship and protection program for emerging models and creatives. It provided legal support, mental health counseling, financial literacy training, and career guidance. It protected young talent from the predatory practices that had destroyed Yusuf's first career. It built networks of support instead of hierarchies of exploitation. "You're going to be fine," Yusuf told Chidi. "More than fine. You're going to be extraordinary. But on days when you forget that, call me. Anytime. I mean it." Chidi left with his portfolio and something more valuable: belief. Yusuf watched him go, then returned to the contract in front of him. International exposure, 6 figures. Everything he'd once dreamed about. His phone buzzed. A text from Malik. "Check your email. The profile piece just went live." The profile was for a major international magazine. A long-form feature titled "The Quiet Revolution: How Yusuf Danjuma is Changing Fashion from the Inside Out." It detailed his career, his disappearance, his comeback. But more than that, it explored his philosophy, his insistence on dignity, his mentorship work, his refusal to let success make him cruel. There was a quote Yusuf had given the interviewer that was already spreading across social media. "Being seen isn't the same as being valued. I spent years being invisible to people who looked right at me. Now I'm visible, and my only goal is to make sure I use that visibility to help others be seen for who they truly are." The article was viral within hours. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of invisibility, of being dismissed, of having their worth determined by others' assumptions. Yusuf's phone exploded with messages, but one stood out. It was from Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi. "I read your interview. You continue to show grace where I showed none. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better. I've started treating my staff as people with stories. It's harder than it sounds. Thank you for the lesson, even though I didn't deserve the gentleness with which you taught it." Yusuf stared at the message for a long time. He could ignore it, could delete it, could maintain the professional distance that protected him from people who'd hurt him before. But his grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, words from childhood he'd almost forgotten. When someone shows you they're learning, acknowledge the effort. Growth is hard enough without being invisible. He typed back, growth is always worth acknowledging. Keep going. 3 words. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. Because Yusuf had learned that cruelty and grace weren't opposites that cancelled each other out. They could coexist. You could acknowledge harm while still seeing someone's effort to change. That evening, Yusuf attended the premiere of a documentary about African fashion. He walked the carpet, did the interviews, smiled for the cameras. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking about trajectories, about how life bends in unexpected directions, about how the lowest point can become the foundation for the highest climb. Inside the theatre, he sat next to Malik, who was beaming with pride. "You know what I realized?" Malik whispered as the lights dimmed. "You didn't change. That's what makes this so powerful. You're still exactly who you were when you were invisible. You just stopped letting other people's blindness convince you that you didn't exist." The documentary began, and there on the screen was Yusuf's face, 40 feet tall, talking about dignity and worth and the revolutionary act of treating people like they matter. "Before we reach the end, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Tales of Us if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't defined by how others see them. Because these are the stories that change lives, and I want to keep bringing them to you." After the premiere, at the after-party, Yusuf found himself in a conversation with a group of young designers. They asked him questions, sought advice, looked at him like he held answers. And he realized something profound. He'd spent so long being invisible that he'd forgotten what it felt like to illuminate others. "The most important thing," he told them, "is to remember that every person you meet has a story you know nothing about. The driver who brings you to work, the cleaner who maintains your office, the server who brings your food. They're not functions. They're complete humans with dreams and histories and potential you can't imagine. And how you treat them says everything about who you are." One of the designers, a young woman with sharp eyes, asked, "Is that what you wish someone had told Mrs. Adeyemi?" The room went quiet. Everyone knew the story. Everyone had read the articles, seen the videos, followed the saga of the driver who became more famous than his employer. Yusuf considered the question carefully. "No," he finally said, "because some lessons can only be learned through consequences. Mrs. Adeyemi needed to lose something to understand what she'd failed to value. That's painful, but it's necessary. Not as punishment, but as education. Do you hate her? No, I pity her. Because she lived with someone extraordinary for 18 months and never even looked closely enough to notice. That's a tragedy for her, not for me. I was always extraordinary. She just convinced herself I wasn't because acknowledging it would have disrupted her worldview. It started small. A client who'd been loyal for 5 years mentioned casually that they were exploring other options for their next project. Another client simply didn't return her calls. Invitations to industry events became less frequent. The social media engagement on her business page began declining week by week. At first, Ibironke told herself it was a coincidence, just a temporary dip. Business had natural rhythms. But then Ronke mentioned something over lunch that made Ibironke's blood run cold. "People are talking," Ronke said carefully, pushing her salad around her plate. "People are always talking." "About how you treated Yusuf. About what kind of person has someone that talented working as their driver for 18 months and never even notices. I noticed he was a good driver." "You know that's not what I mean." Ronke put down her fork. "There are videos, Ibironke, from the party, of you making comments about him. About people who know their place and cheap clothes. Someone recorded you saying those things and now they're circulating with side-by-side photos of Yusuf at your party looking like ₦1,000,000. Ibironke felt her stomach drop. Videos. Multiple, short clips. Posted anonymously but shared everywhere. The narrative isn't great. A wealthy interior architect mocks her driver, not knowing he's actually more successful than she is. It's becoming a cautionary tale about class assumptions. He wasn't more successful than me, Ibironke protested weakly. He is now. Have you seen his billboards? She had. Impossible not to. Yusuf's face was everywhere, and every time Ibironke saw it, she felt something twist in her chest. Not quite regretful, not quite angry. Something more complicated. That evening she went home to Echo Crest and found Yusuf loading his belongings into a taxi. 2 suitcases, 3 boxes, the clothes he'd accumulated during his time in the staff quarters. He moved efficiently without drama. "You're leaving?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, Ma." He didn't stop working. "I didn't fire you." "No, Ma. But I got an apartment in Ikoyi. Closer to the agency, it makes more sense." "Just like that, no notice?" "I gave 2 weeks' notice to the estate manager." He approved my departure. Ibironke watched him lift the last box. "You planned this." "Yes, Ma." "You used my party as your coming-out event. You manipulated the whole situation." Yusuf stopped then, turning to face her fully. His expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't deferential either. "I accepted an invitation you extended. I wore appropriate attire. I behaved respectfully to all guests. If that felt like manipulation, perhaps the manipulation began earlier." The observation landed like a slap. Before Ibironke could respond, Yusuf continued. "I'm grateful for the job, Ma, truly. I needed it when I had nothing else. You gave me stability when I'd lost everything. But I was never the person you saw. I was just the person you decided I was. And the difference between those two things destroyed whatever possibility existed for mutual respect. I treated you fairly. You treated me as invisible. There's a difference between fair treatment and human recognition. You never asked about my past, my goals, my thoughts on anything beyond whether I'd washed the car properly. In 18 months, you never once wondered if I might be more than what you needed me to be. Hit that like button if you're understanding what's really happening here. Because this isn't just about a driver and his employer. It's about how we see people, how we assign value, and how our assumptions reveal more about us than about them. So all of this," Ibironke gestured vaguely at nothing and everything, "is revenge? No, Ma, this is just me living. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm just no longer making myself smaller so you can feel bigger." He got into the taxi and Ibironke watched it drive away, taking with it the last piece of the reality she'd constructed where she was important and he was not. The following months were a study in contrasts. Yusuf's career exploded. The Heritage Collection campaign launched to critical acclaim. Fashion magazines that had ignored him 3 years ago now competed for exclusive interviews. He walked in Lagos Fashion Week to standing ovations. Brands fought to associate themselves with his comeback narrative. But here's what set Yusuf apart from most people who achieve sudden fame. He stayed exactly who he'd always been. Humble. Gracious. Willing to acknowledge his past without being defined by it. In interviews, when asked about his lost years, he spoke honestly. "I was broken by false accusations and public judgment. I disappeared because I didn't know how to defend myself. I took work as a private driver because it was honest work that kept me alive. And I'm grateful for that time because it taught me that dignity doesn't come from what people think about you. It comes from how you treat others, especially when no one's watching." These interviews spread widely. People loved the narrative, humility, perseverance, grace. But they also noticed what Yusuf didn't say. He never named his former employer, never detailed the humiliations, never sought revenge through exposure. Ibironke noticed this too, and it made everything worse, because being attacked would have been easier to handle than being forgiven through silence. Her business continued its slow decline, not catastrophic but steady. Clients left for competitors. Industry respect evaporated. Invitations dried up. And through it all, Yusuf's face smiled down from billboards across the city, a constant reminder of her failure to see what was right in front of her. 6 months after Yusuf left, Ibironke found herself at a design conference where he was speaking on a panel about sustainable fashion and ethical business practices. She hadn't planned to attend, but a client had cancelled their meeting at the last minute, and the conference was happening at the same hotel. Curiosity or masochism, she wasn't sure which, made her slip into the back of the auditorium. Yusuf spoke last. He was composed, articulate, and thoughtful. He discussed the fashion industry's treatment of models as disposable rather than valuable. He talked about the importance of seeing people as complete humans rather than functions. He advocated for better mental health support and more accountability for false accusations. Everything he said was measured, professional, constructive. But Ibironke heard the subtext. She heard her own failures echoed in his call for better treatment. She heard her own cruelty reflected in his emphasis on dignity. When the panel ended, people swarmed Yusuf with questions and networking pitches. Ibironke stayed in her seat watching until the crowd thinned. Then, against every instinct screaming at her to leave, she approached. Yusuf. He turned, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Mrs. Adeyemi, I didn't know you were here. I wasn't planning to be. She shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how uncomfortable she was standing before someone she used to command. You spoke well. Thank you. An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Ibironke forced words past her pride. I treated you badly. For 18 months, I treated you as less than human. I'm sorry. The apology felt like glass in her throat. Yusuf studied her face for a long moment, and she couldn't read what he was thinking. I appreciate you saying that, he said finally. Not quite acceptance, not quite forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. I didn't know, Ibironke continued, the words coming faster now, desperate. I didn't know who you were, what you'd been through, what you were capable of. You didn't ask. His voice was gentle but firm. And that's the real problem, Mrs. Adeyemi. Not that you didn't know my history, but that you never considered I might have one. You saw a driver and decided that was the entirety of who I was. My past wasn't the issue. Your assumption that I didn't deserve curiosity was. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it. It's done. But you can learn from it. You can start seeing the people around you as complete humans with stories that matter. You can stop measuring worth by visibility and start measuring it by character. Someone called Yusuf's name from across the lobby. A photographer wanted shots for an upcoming feature. He glanced back at Ibironke one more time. I hold no anger toward you, he said, but I also don't owe you redemption. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you become someone who sees people. Then he walked away, and Ibironke stood alone in the emptying auditorium, finally understanding the weight of what she'd lost. 2 years after the birthday party, Yusuf received an invitation to speak at a business ethics conference. The topic was Seeing Beyond Positions, Human Value in Professional Spaces. It was being held at one of Lagos's most prestigious venues, and the attendee list read like a who's of the Nigerian business elite. Yusuf accepted, not because he needed the exposure, but because the message mattered. The day of the conference, he arrived early, walking through the venue with the same calm presence that had become his trademark. He was reviewing his notes in the green room when an organizer knocked on the door. Mr. Danjuma, there's someone asking to see you. A Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi? She's not on the speaker list, but she said it's important. Yusuf felt something twist in his chest. He hadn't seen Ibironke in person since that awkward encounter a year ago. They'd exchanged a handful of text messages, always brief, always polite, but distance had been easier than proximity. "Send her in," he said. Ibironke entered, and Yusuf was struck by how different she looked. Not older exactly, but softer somehow, less armoured. She wore a simple dress instead of her usual designer statement pieces. Her makeup was understated. She looked like a person instead of a performance. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your time." "You're here. What do you need?" She sat down uninvited, hands clasped in her lap. "I wanted to tell you something before you go on stage. Something I should have said a long time ago. But I didn't have the words. Or the courage." Yusuf waited. "You were right," Ibironke continued. "About all of it. I didn't see people. I saw functions, positions, uses. And I told myself that was just being professional, being focused, being successful. But it was really just being cruel. And small. And so terrified of my own insignificance that I needed everyone around me to be even smaller." She looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. Real ones. "I lost my business, did you know that? Or most of it anyway. The clients left, the contracts dried up. And I spent months blaming you, blaming social media, blaming everyone but myself. But the truth is I destroyed it. Not by treating you badly, but by being the kind of person who could treat anyone badly and not even notice. Why are you telling me this? Because I rebuilt it, slowly, painfully. I had to start over, take smaller clients, and prove myself again. And in the process I learned something. I learned that the staff I'd ignored for years had incredible ideas, that the junior people I'd dismissed had insights I'd never considered. That treating people with dignity didn't make me weaker. It made the work better. She pulled out her phone, showed him her business Instagram. The posts were different now. Less about her, more about collaboration. Photos of her team, credits for everyone involved, behind-the-scenes content that showed the human side of design work. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Ibironke said. "I'm not asking for anything, really. I just wanted you to know that the lesson took, even if it took losing everything for me to learn it. You changed my life, Yusuf. Not by being cruel back to me, but by showing me what dignity looks like even when you have every right to be angry." Yusuf was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something my grandmother used to say?" Ibironke nodded. She said, "The person who learns from pain but doesn't become pain is the person who truly changes the world. You learned. That matters. It doesn't undo what was done, but it means something moving forward." "Thank you," Ibironke whispered. "Thank you for telling me. Most people never admit when they're wrong. Most people just quietly shift and hope no one notices the person they used to be." There was a knock on the door. 5 minutes until he was on stage. "I should go," Ibironke said, standing. I needed you to know." She turned to leave, but Yusuf called her back. "Mrs. Adeyemi? Please, just Ibironke." "Ibironke?" "What you're doing now, rebuilding with humanity instead of hierarchy. That's the work. That's what matters. Keep doing it." She smiled, and it was genuine for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. "I will. And Yusuf? When you tell your story on that stage today, don't protect me. Tell the truth. People need to hear it. I need to be accountable for it." Then she left, and Yusuf stood alone in the green room, feeling something shift in his chest. Not quite closure, because some stories don't close neatly, but completion. The kind that comes when pain transforms into purpose, and everyone involved grows from the transformation. He walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The auditorium was packed. Faces looked up at him expectantly, waiting for wisdom, inspiration, the story they'd all heard pieces of but never the full truth. Yusuf stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, and began. 2 years ago, I was a driver for a woman who thought I was nothing. And the tragedy wasn't that she thought it. The tragedy was that I almost believed her. He told them everything: the humiliations, the burned dress, the birthday party trap that became a transformation, the moment he decided that being invisible was more dangerous than being seen. And through it all, he wove the larger message that dignity isn't given by others, it's claimed by yourself. Here's what I learned, Yusuf said, nearing the end of his talk. Power isn't about making others small. It's about recognizing that everyone around you is complete and complex and valuable. And when you treat people that way, you don't lose power. You multiply it. Because suddenly, you're not one person trying to control everything. You're a community of people all bringing their full selves to work. He paused, looking directly into the audience. If you employ people, I want you to ask yourself, do you see them? Really see them? Do you know their names, their goals, their stories? Or are they just functions that make your life easier? Because the difference between those two approaches isn't just ethical, it's practical. You might be working alongside the next brilliant mind in your industry, and you'll never know it because you decided their position determined their worth. The applause when he finished was more than polite appreciation. It felt like recognition, like people understanding something they'd sensed but never articulated. Afterward, dozens of people approached him. Business owners asking for guidance on creating dignified workplaces, employees sharing their own stories of invisibility. Young professionals thanked him for giving language to experiences they'd never known how to describe. And standing in the back of the room, watching it all, was Ibironke. She didn't approach him again, just nodded once, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, and left. Yusuf watched her go and realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let the past determine the future. Ibironke would always be the person who'd treated him cruelly, but she was also becoming someone who'd learned from that cruelty. Both truths could exist simultaneously. That night, Yusuf returned to his apartment in Ikoyi, the space he'd made his own with carefully chosen furniture and walls covered in photographs from his journey. Not just the glamorous modelling shots, but pictures of the staff quarters at Echo Crest, of the construction site where everything began, of the young mentees he was now guiding through their own transformations. He sat on his balcony, looking out at the Lagos skyline, and thought about trajectories. About how the lowest point isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a different chapter. About how pain can either destroy you or refine you, and the choice isn't always obvious in the moment, but becomes clear in retrospect. His phone buzzed. A message from Chidi, the young model he'd mentored. Just booked my first major campaign. Thank you for believing I was someone before the world agreed. Yusuf smiled and typed back, you were always someone. The campaign just made it official. He thought about all the people he'd met who carried their own versions of invisibility, the cleaners and drivers and servers and assistants who the world looked past every single day. The ones with talents hiding beneath uniforms and exhaustion and the weight of being dismissed. He thought about how many extraordinary stories were being ignored simply because people decided someone's position meant they weren't worth curiosity. And he made a promise to himself. He would never stop seeing, would never stop asking, would never stop treating every person as if they might be carrying brilliance that the world had failed to notice, because he knew what it felt like to carry that brilliance alone. And he knew what it felt like when someone finally looked close enough to see it. 3 years after the birthday party that changed everything, Yusuf stood on a stage in Paris, having just walked for one of the world's most prestigious fashion houses. The show was a triumph. The reviews were glowing. And afterward, at the after-party, someone asked him the question he'd been asked 1,000 times. What's the secret to your success? Yusuf thought about cement sacks and staff quarters and burned dresses and a woman who'd tried to humiliate him and accidentally freed him instead. He thought about every person who'd looked past him and every person who'd finally looked at him and the difference between the two. The secret, he said, is knowing that dignity is yours. It doesn't come from what people think about you. It comes from how you see yourself and how you treat others. Everything else is just noise. That quote spread across social media within hours. It was printed on inspirational posters. It was cited in business books. It became one of those phrases people repeated when they needed reminding that their worth wasn't determined by external validation. But for Yusuf, it was just the truth. Simple, hard-earned truth. And now, as we close this story, I want you to do something. Share this video with someone who feels invisible, someone who's being overlooked, someone who needs to know that the lowest point isn't the end. It's just the ground floor of something higher. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. And in the comments, tell me, who in your life have you been looking past? Who deserves to be seen? Because this story isn't really about Yusuf Danjuma or Mrs. Ibironke Adeyemi. It's about all of us. About the choice we make every single day between seeing people or just seeing positions. Between recognizing humanity or just recognizing usefulness. Between building each other up or tearing each other down to feel taller. Yusuf chose dignity when he had every reason to choose bitterness. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. The person who once carried cement sacks until he collapsed now carries a message that's changing how people think about worth, value, and human dignity across an entire industry. And somewhere in Lagos, in a smaller office with a smaller team, Ibironke Adeyemi is learning every day to see people she once would have dismissed. Learning that power isn't about control, it's about connection. Learning that the person you're ignoring today might be the person who teaches you the most important lesson of your life tomorrow. This has been Tales of Us. May you see and be seen. May you value and be valued. May you never forget that every person you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. And may you always, always look closely enough to notice